Imagine waking up without a city around you, no roads stretching to the horizon, no neighborhoods, no markets, no walls, just open land in every direction, cool and enormous and ancient. The kind of silence that feels less like quiet and more like the world simply breathing. For most of human history, this was the only world there was. People moved through it, followed it, belonged to it in a way that felt less like a choice and more like a rhythm. And then something changed. Somewhere along the deep, unhurried timeline of human life, people began to slow down. They began to return to the same places, to stay. And from that stillness, the first communities emerged, fragile, fascinating, and far older than most of us ever learned in school. The question of why humans stopped wandering is one of the great quiet mysteries of our past. It was not a single morning when someone decided to build a wall or plant a field. It was almost certainly slower than that, more tentative, shaped by forces as large as the climate itself, and as intimate as the need to feel somewhere was home. The shift from motion to settlement likely happened in layers, over generations, with people perhaps not even knowing they were doing something new. What we do have are clues, ancient places like Jericho, tucked into the Jordan Valley near a reliable spring, where archaeologists have found layer after layer of human presence, stretching back more than 10,000 years. Not the first settlement, perhaps, and not a city in any modern sense of the word, but something, a gathering, a choice to return, a hint of permanence in a world still largely on the move. These early communities are not simple origin points with clean start dates. They are more like windows, each one offering a glimpse into a world in the middle of becoming something it had never been before. Tonight we are going to follow that slow transformation together. We will walk through the world as it was when almost everyone still moved with the seasons, and we will trace the quiet, remarkable steps that eventually led to streets and walls and the first recognizable shape of a city. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Wherever you are right now, whether you are curled up in bed, resting on a couch, or somewhere unexpected entirely, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is there. This story travelled across thousands of years to reach you. It is lovely to know where it has landed. For most of human history, and we are talking about a stretch of time so long it makes the last 10,000 years look like a footnote, people moved. Not because they were lost, and not because they had failed to figure out something better. They moved because movement worked. Picture a small group, perhaps a few dozen people, following the arc of a season across a landscape they knew as intimately as you know your own neighborhood. They knew where the deer gathered in autumn, where the wild grains ripened first, where the river ran clear in summer and flooded wide in spring. This knowledge was not written down. It lived in the body, passed from elder to child the way a song gets passed, by repetition, by presence, by the slow accumulation of experience over lifetimes. Their diet was extraordinarily varied, roots and berries and seeds and fish and game, shifting with the season, shifting with the place. Researchers who have studied the remains and the habits of hunter-gatherer communities suggest that this variety may have made them remarkably resilient. If one food source failed, there were others. If the land in one direction became scarce, there was always another direction. Mobility itself was a form of insurance. They were not simply surviving. There is mounting evidence that many hunter-gatherer groups worked fewer hours per day to meet their needs than early farmers would. They left time for story and ceremony, for craft, for rest. The image of early humans as desperate, scrabbling, and primitive is one that archaeology has been quietly dismantling for decades. These were people with rich social lives, complex belief systems, and a detailed, sophisticated understanding of the natural world around them. And they were not entirely without place. This is something easy to miss. Even people who moved did not wander randomly. They returned. Season after season, certain sites pulled groups back. A sheltered valley where winters were mild, a hilltop with a long view across the plain, a spring that never ran dry. Some of these return points became something more than camps. They became gathering places where separate groups might converge once a year to trade, to arrange marriages, to share stories, to mourn together, to mark time. Sites like Göbekli Tepe in what is now southern Turkey, built by people who were still largely mobile, still hunting, still moving, hint at how elaborate these gatherings could become. People without permanent homes nonetheless built something permanent, something worth returning to. Trade routes too shaped the wandering world. Obsidian and shells and ochre moved across hundreds of miles of landscape long before anyone had built a wall or dug a field. These were not isolated groups stumbling through a vast unknown. They were connected, networked, aware of one another across great distances. The wandering world had its own geography, its own infrastructure, built not from stone and mortar, but from habit and relationship and the steady repetition of familiar paths. But it was not without pressures. Even before the shift towards settlement began in earnest, some groups likely lingered longer in certain places. A particularly abundant stretch of coastline, a forest rich with game, a river valley where the harvest of wild plants was so reliable that leaving felt like waste. These could slow a group down, hold them through a second season, then a third. The decision to stay, if it was ever a single decision at all, may have begun as something much smaller, a reluctance to leave what was already good. And so the line between nomad and settler, which feels so clean and obvious from a distance, begins to blur when you look closely. It was probably never a line at all. It was more like a gradual leaning, a shift in weight, a tilting toward the familiar. Some groups may have moved seasonally for generations, while also maintaining a place they thought of as central, as home in some deeper sense, even if it was not permanently occupied. Others may have edged towards staying without ever quite deciding to. The wandering world did not end. It transformed, slowly, unevenly, differently in different places, shaped by forces that were about to change everything. Around 14,000 years ago, the world began to exhale. The great ice sheets that had pressed down over vast stretches of the northern hemisphere, sheets so thick and heavy they had reshaped the land beneath them, began, slowly, to retreat. It was not a sudden thaw. It was a gradual loosening, a warming that unfolded across centuries, the kind of change no single human lifetime could fully witness, but that generations of people must have felt accumulating around them. Rivers that had been locked in ice began to run again. Forests crept northward into landscapes that had been open and cold and spare. The tundra gave way in places to woodland, and the woodland in places to something lush. For the people moving through this world, the change would have registered first in small ways. Animals appearing in new territories, plants blooming earlier, a valley that had been too cold for comfortable wintering, slowly becoming a place where a group could linger longer into the season. The world was not simply warming, it was reorganizing, and the map of where food could be found was being redrawn. In the region we now call the Fertile Crescent, stretching across parts of what is modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon, the warming climate created something remarkable. Bands of landscape where wild grasses grew thick and generous, where water gathered in reliable places, where the density of available food was simply higher than it had been before. Wild ancestors of wheat and barley spread across hillsides. Gazelle and aurochs and wild boar populated the valleys. For groups who knew this terrain, who had been reading its patterns for generations, the abundance would have been extraordinary. Not just enough, more than enough. And more than enough changes behavior. When food is dense and reliable, the logic of moving shifts. If a valley produces so much wild grain in autumn that you cannot possibly carry it all with you, why leave before you have used it? If the gazelle returned to the same lowland every spring without fail, why spend that season somewhere else? The wandering life had always been shaped by scarcity and seasonal rhythm, but now, in these richer pockets of landscape, the rhythm itself was changing. Staying longer became sensible. Returning became not just habit, but strategy. But the warming did not proceed smoothly. This is where the story becomes more complicated and more interesting. Roughly 12,900 years ago, something shifted. Temperatures that had been climbing dropped sharply, and in some regions dropped dramatically, in what geologists and climate scientists now call the Younger Dryas. The cause is still debated, but the effect is not. For somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 years, the warming stalled. In some places, it reversed. The cold returned, not as severe as the peak of the Ice Age, but enough to contract the zones of abundance that had been expanding. Forests retreated. Water sources that had grown reliable became uncertain again. The rich carpets of wild grain thinned. What happens to people when abundance disappears? The most obvious response is to move, to fall back on the mobility that had served for so long. And many groups likely did exactly that. But there is another possibility, one that some researchers find compelling when they look at the archaeological evidence from this period. Instability, paradoxically, can drive experimentation. When the old patterns stop working, people try new things. When you cannot count on the valley producing what it always produced, you begin to think about how to influence what it produces. You think about storage. You think about cultivation. Not farming yet, not the deliberate planting and tending and harvesting of domesticated crops, but something earlier, something more tentative, encouraging the plants that matter, protecting the patches that produce, returning to seed a place before the season begins. The younger Dryas in this reading was not simply a setback. It may have been a pressure that pushed human creativity in new directions. The uncertainty that made life harder may also have made people more willing to try things that, in times of easy abundance, there would have been no reason to try. When the younger Dryas ended around 11,700 years ago, the warming resumed, and this time it produced conditions even richer than before. The shift into what geologists call the Holocene, the epoch we are still living in, brought a climate that was, for much of the world, more stable and more generous than anything humans had experienced in tens of thousands of years. The zones of abundance expanded again. Wild grains thickened, water settled into reliable patterns. And the groups who had spent the cold centuries experimenting with new relationships to the land now found themselves in a world that could reward those experiments. Access to water shaped everything. In the years following the younger Dryas, rivers and lakes in the Fertile Crescent and elsewhere stabilized in ways that made certain places dramatically more attractive than others. A spring that ran year-round was not just convenient, it was a kind of anchor, a river that could be read, that flooded on a predictable schedule and left fertile soil in its retreat, was a resource unlike any that could be carried. You could not take it with you, but you could stay near it, and staying near it over time could mean something entirely new. None of this made settlement inevitable. Climate is not destiny, and the people living through these changes were making choices, weighing possibilities, responding to circumstances in ways shaped by their own histories and social structures and the particular landscapes they inhabited. The climate did not build cities. What it did was rearrange the possibilities, open certain doors, close others, and leave it to human ingenuity and human restlessness and human attachment to decide what to do with the room it had made. The wandering world had been shaped by the land. Now, the land was changing, and quietly, in a few specific places, the shape of human life was beginning to change with it. The change did not announce itself. There was no moment when a group of people sat down together and decided collectively that they were done wandering. It happened in smaller increments than that, built from decisions that each made sense on their own, in their own season, without any awareness of where they were all leading. Consider what it would mean to come back. Groups had always had territories, landscapes they knew, circuits they travelled in rough seasonal rhythm. But there is a difference between passing through a place and returning to one. And sometime after the warming resumed, in certain well-watered valleys and along certain generous hillsides, people began to come back to the same spots, not just out of habit but out of investment. They had left something there. A cache of stored food tucked beneath flat stones, a hearth built with care, ringed with larger rocks, placed so the smoke drew out and the warmth stayed in. A structure, not just a windbreak of branches, but something more deliberate, something framed with posts, floored with packed earth, meant to be inhabited rather than merely sheltered in. When you build something, you have a reason to return to it. When you return to it and find it still standing, you have a reason to improve it. And when you improve it and return again, You have, without quite deciding to, made a place. The archaeology of this period reveals something quietly remarkable. The same locations being used not once, but repeatedly, rebuilt in the same spot, the floors repaired, the hearths rekindled, the middens accumulating. The rubbish heaps alone tell a story. A single visit leaves almost nothing. A seasonal camp leaves a thin scatter. But a place returned to year after year leaves depth, layers, the slow accumulation of human presence pressed into the ground. Archaeologists read those layers the way you might read rings in a tree, as evidence of time, of return, of something that kept drawing people back. Storage was part of what made return worthwhile. A clay-lined pit, a basket woven tight enough to hold grain, a cool corner of a built space where dried food could wait. These were not small things. Storage is a kind of argument about the future. It says, I expect to be here long enough to use this. It says, I trust this place enough to leave what I need here. It binds people to location in ways that are practical and also, quietly, psychological. You do not abandon a storehouse the way you abandon a camping spot. But alongside the built structures and the stored food, something else was changing in the relationship between people and the land around them. It was subtler than farming, and it came before farming, and it may have mattered just as much. People had always known which plants were useful. Tens of thousands of years of moving through the world had produced an intimate, accumulated knowledge of what grew where and when and what it was good for. But knowing a plant and managing it are different things. At some point, and this transition is difficult to see clearly in the archaeological record precisely because it was so gradual, people began to act on that knowledge in new ways. They cleared competing growth from around the patches of wild grain they relied on. They returned seeds to the earth where the harvest had been best. They kept animals from overgrazing the hillsides where certain plants grew thick. They noticed which trees produced the most reliably and perhaps tended those, discouraged others. This was not agriculture, not yet. But it was something more than simple foraging. It was the management of a landscape, a slow reaching across the line between taking what the world offered and shaping what the world offered. The people doing it may not have thought of themselves as farmers in any sense. They were doing what worked. They were making the land more productive in the ways they already understood productivity. The category of farmer was something the future would invent. These people were simply paying attention and acting on what they saw. The domestication of animals followed a similarly gradual arc. Goats and sheep and pigs were not captured and contained in a single generation. They were habituated slowly over many generations. The less fearful animals tolerated, the more aggressive ones not, until the relationship between human groups and certain herds became something mutual and strange, neither fully wild nor fully controlled. Tending a herd is not the same as hunting. It requires you to stay close, to move with the animals, or to keep them near enough to you that their rhythms and yours begin to merge. It is a form of attachment that resists easy mobility. Food surplus is sometimes described as the engine of all this. The argument being that only once people could produce more than they immediately needed could anything like settled society begin. And surplus matters, genuinely. It allows some people to do things other than find food, and that specialization is the seed of much that follows. But surplus alone does not explain what drew people together and kept them there. The fuller answer involves something less quantifiable. Living close together for longer stretches does things to people. It creates obligations. It creates disputes that need to be resolved. It creates the possibility of watching someone else's skill and learning from it, or watching someone else's misfortune and being reminded of your own vulnerability. It creates the need for rules, not written ones, not yet, but the kind that live in shared understanding, in custom, in the quiet pressure of community expectation. The social world that emerges when people stop scattering is more complex, more demanding, and perhaps also more sustaining than anything a solitary family moving through an open landscape could build. The camps that became villages were not just places to store food or sleep in the same spot twice. They were the beginning of a different kind of human life, one shaped by nearness, by the layered obligations of staying, by the strange and difficult and generative experiment of choosing. Season after season, not to leave. There is a place in the Jordan Valley where a spring rises out of the earth with unusual generosity, pouring clean water into a landscape that is otherwise dry and unforgiving. The hills around it are pale and ancient. The air in summer is hot enough to shimmer. And yet here, or very near here, people have been living, almost continuously, for something close to 11,000 years. The place is Jericho. And while calling it the first city invites immediate and reasonable disagreement, it remains one of the most important windows we have into what was beginning to happen when humans first started choosing, again and again, to stay. The spring was the reason. Fresh water in an arid valley is not a small thing. It is everything. It shapes the entire logic of a place. It means crops can grow where otherwise they couldn't. It means animals come to drink, which means hunting is reliable. It means you do not have to carry water from somewhere distant, do not have to chase the season to stay near enough to it. Jericho's spring, called Ain Sultan, was productive enough that it could sustain a population in one location indefinitely, or close enough to indefinitely that the distinction may not have mattered to the people living there. They came back to it the way the previous camps and the careful hearths suggested people were beginning to come back to things. Because they had invested in it, because it gave back what they put in, because leaving would mean giving up something that worked. What the archaeologists found when they began excavating Jericho in the mid-20th century was a tell, a mound built up from centuries of human habitation, one layer pressing down on another, the accumulated weight of generations. Inside that mound, they found evidence of settlement reaching back to a time before farming was well established, before pottery, before the full suite of things we associate with civilization. And within those layers, they found something that stopped them, a tower. The tower at Jericho is roughly 9,000 years old, possibly older in its earliest form. It is made of stone. It stands, or stood, before excavation, to a height of nearly 9 meters, with an interior staircase cut into the stone. It is not a small or casual structure. It required coordination to build. It required people to agree on a plan and then to work together toward it over a sustained period, contributing labour to something that was not a single family's shelter, but a collective project. Around the tower, or associated with it in ways archaeologists are still working to understand, there were also walls, thick stone walls encircling part of the settlement. And here the debate begins, because what those walls were for is not certain, and the uncertainty is itself illuminating. The obvious answer is defence. Walls keep people out. A settlement with stored food and reliable water is a settlement worth raiding. And protection against raiding is a practical motivation that fits neatly with a certain story about early human society. That competition was fierce, that resources were contested, that violence was a constant pressure shaping how people organized themselves. This is possible. It may even be true. But there are other possibilities that the evidence does not rule out. Some researchers have suggested that Jericho's walls may have been built, at least partly, as a flood barrier. The valley is prone to flash flooding, and a substantial wall around a low-lying settlement would not be a strange response to a recurring threat. Others have pointed to the tower itself, with its deliberately constructed interior staircase and its unusual placement, and suggested that it may have served a ritual or symbolic function, a way of marking the settlement's importance, of making a statement about the people who lived there, of organising communal activity around something that pointed upward and could be seen from a distance. Status, too, is a form of defence. A settlement that looks organised and capable is one that might be approached differently than one that does not. The honest answer is that we do not know, and the walls and tower at Jericho may have served several purposes simultaneously, none of them fully separable from the others. What we can say with more confidence is what they reveal about the people who built them. To build a stone tower 9 meters high with an interior staircase, you need more than willing hands. You need someone, or some group, some process, capable of directing labour over time, of sustaining collective effort across the days and weeks, and perhaps seasons such a project would require. You need agreement about whose labour counts and how it is compensated, or at minimum, a social structure capable of producing that kind of sustained cooperation without it dissolving into conflict. Jericho's tower is evidence not just of construction, but of organization, of the social machinery that makes large projects possible. This is what places like Jericho begin to reveal as you look at them carefully. That the transition from village to something more was not primarily a technological story, though technology was part of it. It was a social story. The question of how you get people to build a tower together is the same question in a different form as the question of how you get people to live together without tearing each other apart. The answers to both questions are the same, and they involve negotiation, hierarchy, custom, shared belief, and the slow construction of a community that is something more than just a collection of individuals who happen to be sleeping in the same place. Whether Jericho was truly a city in any meaningful sense is a question that depends entirely on how you define your terms, and scholars have been arguing about those definitions for decades. It was not a city the way later cities would be cities, with specialized trades and monumental temples and thousands of inhabitants. But something was happening there that pointed in that direction. Something was being worked out in stone and labor and returning season after season to the same generous spring about what it meant to make a place that was more than temporary, more than personal, more than just a shelter against the night. And yet the walls and the tower, however remarkable, only answer part of the question. They tell us what people built once they had already decided to stay together. What they don't quite tell us is why people wanted to be near each other in the first place. What drew individuals and families and small bands into the same orbit, season after season, until staying became a habit and a habit became a home. The economic explanations come easily. Water, food, safety, these are real. A settlement near a reliable spring is a settlement that does not have to gamble on survival the way a fully mobile group sometimes does. Stored grain means that a bad season doesn't have to be a catastrophe. A community large enough to post a watch, to organize a defense, to respond collectively to threat, is one where the odds of surviving a bad night are meaningfully better than they are alone. These are not small considerations. They are the kind of considerations that, compounded over generations, shape behavior in lasting ways. But if pure economics were the whole story, the surprise is that people didn't settle down sooner. The resources were often there, the calculations were available, and yet for most of human prehistory, people chose mobility, or rather, mobility worked well enough that the pull toward permanence wasn't quite strong enough to overcome the advantages of moving. Something else must have been part of the equation. Something that made gathering feel not just useful but necessary, not just practical, but meaningful. Kinship is one piece of it. The networks of relationship that mobile societies maintain, the cousins and in-laws and allied bands scattered across a landscape, require regular contact to stay alive. You do not stay connected to people you never see. And so there were gatherings, seasonal or ceremonial or both, where groups came together to renew bonds, to arrange marriages, to exchange children and obligations and news. These gatherings were not simply social pleasures, though they may well have been pleasurable. They were the maintenance work of a social world, the thing that kept the network functional, so that in a hard season you could call on someone and someone could call on you. A fixed place where such gatherings reliably happened would become, over time, a place with weight, a place that meant something. Then there is the pull of the sacred. Across many early cultures, certain locations were understood to be significant, not just for what they offered practically, but for what they represented spiritually or cosmologically. Places where the boundary between the ordinary world and something larger felt thin, where the dead were buried and the ancestors were therefore present, where rituals had been performed so many times that the ground itself seemed to hold the memory of them. Göbekli Tepe, in what is now southeastern Turkey, offers one of the most striking known examples of this kind of magnetism. Built by people who were still largely mobile hunter-gatherers, its massive carved stone pillars required extraordinary collective effort, Effort that suggests people were willing to travel considerable distances and coordinate with near strangers, not because a spring told them to, but because something about the place demanded it. The sacred could move people before the practical had fully made its argument. Feasting, too, matters more than it might seem. The anthropological record suggests again and again that the ability to host, to gather people and feed them abundantly, is one of the primary ways that status is built and social bonds are reinforced in early communities. A settlement with stored surplus could offer hospitality that a mobile camp could not. And hospitality creates obligation. When you have eaten someone's food and sheltered under their roof, you owe them something. And that web of owing and being owed is the invisible architecture of a community. The thing that holds people in proximity, even when proximity is inconvenient. Craft and trade add another layer. As some people began to specialize, knapping flint with unusual skill, making vessels that held water reliably, understanding the stars well enough to know when to plant, their presence became valuable in a way that encouraged others to cluster around them. And trade between communities requires meeting points, places where different groups could exchange goods without the friction of uncertainty about who they were dealing with. Central places grew partly because they were convenient nodes in a network, points where things and people could converge and then disperse again, each time leaving a little more behind. What emerges, when you look at all of this together, is a picture more tangled and more human than pure resource logic suggests. People gathered and stayed gathered for reasons that included the practical but extended well beyond it. They gathered because their relatives were there, because their dead were buried there, and the dead have a way of anchoring the living to places in ways that resist easy relocation, because the feasts and the rituals and the marriages had always happened there, and changing that would mean remaking not just a living arrangement, but an identity. Because the stories that explained who they were stories set in that particular valley, near that particular spring, under that particular sky. Leadership, too, shifts when communities grow. In a small mobile band, decisions can be made by rough consensus, and authority tends to be situational. The best hunter leads the hunt, the most experienced elder speaks in dispute. But as communities grow larger and more complex, as the obligations multiply and the conflicts become more intricate, something more formal begins to be needed. Someone to adjudicate, someone to organize the labor for the next wall, the next storage pit, the next season's planting. The emergence of that kind of authority is not simply a power grab, though it sometimes becomes one. It is also a response to the genuine complexity that comes with living closely together, with more people, across more time than any small band had to manage. And perhaps underneath all of it, the economics and the kinship and the ritual and the trade is something simpler and harder to name. The feeling of belonging somewhere, of being known, of waking in the morning and having the landscape around you be familiar, layered with memory, full of faces you recognize. That feeling is not nothing. It may, in the end, have been as powerful as any spring. But belonging somewhere comes with a price. And that price, when you begin to examine it honestly, turns out to be steeper than the story of early cities usually admits. The first settlers didn't step into a better life so much as they stepped into a different one. One with different dangers, different losses, different burdens. Some of those burdens were immediately obvious. Others crept in slowly, accumulating over generations before anyone could quite see what had changed. Consider the body. A mobile band moving across a landscape is, in a certain sense, a self-cleaning system. When a campsite becomes fouled or punched, when waste accumulates, when insects multiply, when the ground around the fire starts to carry the smell of too many people living too closely, you leave, you move on. The landscape absorbs what you left behind, and you begin again somewhere cleaner. A permanent settlement cannot do this. The people stay, and so does everything they produce. Waste builds up near water sources. Animals drawn by stored food bring their own parasites. People living in close quarters share not just meals and stories, but illnesses, in ways that a scattered mobile life largely prevents. The bones recovered from early settlement sites, sometimes tell a quieter, grimmer story than the walls and granaries suggest. Signs of infectious disease, of anemia, of the kinds of stress that come from bodies fighting things they were not, evolutionarily speaking, designed to fight in such concentration. The diet narrowed too. This seems counterintuitive at first. Agriculture is abundance, we tend to think. The whole point of cultivation is more food, more reliably. And in terms of calories and predictability, that is often true. A stored surplus is a genuine achievement, a buffer against the seasons that a foraging life cannot quite match. But the diversity disappears. A hunter-gatherer moving through a rich landscape might draw from dozens or hundreds of different plant and animal sources across the course of a year, each with its own nutrients, its own seasonal timing, its own particular contribution to a varied and resilient diet. A farming community increasingly comes to depend on a small number of cultivated species, the grains that store well, the plants that respond to deliberate tending. When those crops fail, there is less to fall back on, and even in good years, the body subsisting on wheat and stored barley is eating a narrower palate than the body that had once ranged freely across a varied world. Then there is what permanence does to the social fabric, and here the costs become harder to measure, but no less real. Property appears. When you move constantly, ownership is limited to what you can carry, and the logic of accumulation doesn't have much room to operate. But when you build a house, dig a field, fill a storage pit, the question of who owns what becomes suddenly urgent and endlessly complicated. And ownership that differs in scale, one family's granary larger than another's, one household's land more fertile or better situated, creates the conditions for inequality in a way that mobile life tends to resist. The archaeological record at many early settlement sites shows signs of this gradual stratification. Some burials richer than others, some structures larger, some individuals apparently commanding resources and perhaps labour that others did not. Whether this happened quickly or slowly varied from place to place, but the direction was consistent. Settling down, it seems, is good for hierarchies. Conflict changes too. Among mobile bands, a dispute that cannot be resolved has a natural remedy. One group leaves, and distance does the work that negotiation could not. In a fixed settlement, especially one surrounded by other fixed settlements, that option closes. The people you quarrel with are also your neighbours, your co-workers on the next wall-building project, the families your children will eventually marry into. Managing that friction requires something more elaborate than simply walking away. It requires rules, enforcement, and, eventually, someone with the authority to impose both. Power structures that might never have crystallized in a mobile world begin to harden in a settled one. Labour, too, takes on a new character. The work of a mobile life is seasonal and varied, hunting, gathering, moving camp, maintaining tools and relationships. The work of a settled life is relentless and often monotonous. Fields require tending from the first thaw to the last harvest, and then through the long labour of processing and storing. Walls crack and must be repaired. Storage pits rot and must be rebuilt. Houses need new roofing, new plaster, new attention. The infrastructure of permanence is hungry for human effort in a way that no campsite ever was. And the people doing that work are not always the same people whose names, centuries later, get attached to the great achievements of the settlement. It is worth pausing here to notice something that the archaeology quietly confirms. Not everyone, in any given time or place, wanted to make this trade. Evidence from many regions suggests that the transition to settled life was not a single decisive moment, but a long, messy negotiation, one that different groups resolved differently at different times and with different degrees of commitment. Some communities moved between seasons and lifestyles, farming in one part of the year and ranging more freely in another. Some groups at the edges of early agricultural zones appear to have watched their neighbours settle down and chosen not to follow. The choice, where it existed, was not unanimous, and in some cases, groups that had begun to settle appear to have pulled back, dispersed again, traded the grain pit for the open path, found the old mobility preferable to the new complications. That resistance is worth taking seriously because it reminds us that the story of settlement is not the story of people discovering an obvious improvement and embracing it gratefully. It is the story of a trade-off, genuine, difficult, and differently weighted depending on who you were and where you stood within the emerging order. The walls of Jericho protected someone, but they also enclosed someone, and those two things were not always the same person. And yet, despite the costs, despite the narrowed diets and the accumulated waste and the hardening hierarchies and the labour that never quite ended, people stayed. More than stayed. Over generations the settlements grew. This is where the story takes a turn that even the people living through it might not have recognised as a turn. Because the shift from a village to a city is not simply a matter of adding more people to a fixed settlement. Something qualitatively different happens when a community crosses certain thresholds, when the surplus becomes large enough to free some people from the work of producing it, when the interactions between households become too complex to manage through memory and relationship alone, when strangers begin arriving not just to trade, but to live. The village and the city occupy different worlds, even when one grows directly out of the other. Consider a place like Çatalhöyük, that dense, remarkable settlement in what is now central Turkey, occupied for more than 1,000 years, beginning around 9,000 years ago. By any measure, it was large. Perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 people living in mud brick houses packed so tightly together that there were no streets between them, only rooftops, and people moved through their world by climbing up and dropping down through holes in the ceiling. It was, in its own way, extraordinary, and yet most archaeologists hesitate to call it a city in the fullest sense. The evidence suggests a community of remarkable equality, no obvious palace, no clear administrative centre, no strong signs of the specialised labour and institutionalised hierarchy that cities, as we tend to understand them, seem to require. It was a vast village, perhaps, a community that had scaled up without fully transforming. The transformation, when it came, appears to have depended on something more than size. It depended on surplus finding a direction. When agricultural communities began producing more than they needed to survive a single season, that surplus had to go somewhere. Some of it was stored, as we have already seen, built into granaries, buried in pits, held in reserve against the seasons. But surplus also moves. It attracts. A community with stored grain and a reliable harvest becomes a destination, and destinations generate trade, and trade generates the need for people who are good at managing it. Specialists emerge, not farmers, not herders, but craftspeople, merchants, administrators, priests. People whose entire contribution to the community is something other than the direct production of food. A village can sustain a few such individuals at its margins. A city, in some sense, is what happens when the surplus becomes large enough to sustain many. This is roughly the story of Uruk, in what is now southern Iraq, which by around 5,000 years ago had grown into something that genuinely strains the word settlement. Tens of thousands of people, monumental temple complexes rising above a flat landscape, evidence of long-distance trade reaching across hundreds of miles, and, perhaps most consequentially, the earliest known writing, appearing not as poetry or prayer, but as accounting. Lists of goods received and distributed, records of labour, tallies of animals and grain. The city needed memory that individual minds could not hold, and so it invented a way to store memory outside the mind. Writing, in this telling, is not the product of a single brilliant invention, but the administrative necessity of a community that had grown too large and too complex to run on trust and personal knowledge alone. That is a remarkable thing to sit with quietly. The technology that would eventually carry philosophy and literature and the accumulated knowledge of civilizations began, as far as we can tell, as a way to track who owed what to whom. And Uruk was not alone. Across a broad arc of the ancient world, the Indus Valley, the Yellow River Basin, the highlands of Peru, the river systems of Mesoamerica, similar accumulations were happening, each with its own timing, its own character, its own particular path from dispersed camps to crowded streets. Some of these places we know well, others we know only as outlines, their writing still undeciphered, or their remains still beneath the soil. The story of the first cities is not a single story with a single location. It is a story that seems to have wanted to happen again and again, wherever the conditions allowed. Which brings us back to the question that has been hovering over this whole long journey, the question of which city came first, and what first even means. If a city requires monumental architecture, Jericho's walls press the timeline back further than almost anywhere else. If a city requires writing, Uruk holds a strong claim. If it requires dense population, Çatalhöyük enters the conversation. If it requires specialized labor and trade networks, other candidates emerge. The honest answer, the one that the archaeology tends to support, is that there may not be a single first city, only a series of gradual thresholds, crossed at different times in different places, as communities accumulated the surpluses and the complications and the innovations that city life requires. What there was, at the beginning, was a choice, or rather, thousands of choices made by thousands of people over thousands of years. A family deciding to stay near a reliable spring. A community building a wall not because a city was planned, but because the grain needed protecting tonight. A surplus offered to a stranger and accepted, setting in motion a relationship that would outlast the people who began it. No one, in those early generations, was building towards civilization. They were solving problems in front of them, one season at a time, one wall at a time, one careful accounting mark pressed into soft clay. The city was not the plan. It was the outcome. So why, across so much of the ancient world and across so many thousands of years, did wandering slow? The answer is not a single one. It never is, with human beings. Climate shifted the odds. Warming temperatures and reliable rains made certain places generous in ways they had not been before, and communities learned to read that generosity and stay close to it. Water drew people in and held them, the way a river holds its own banks. Stored food changed the mathematics of survival, making it possible to endure the lean months without moving on. Ritual gathered people to places that felt significant, and significance has a gravity of its own. Trade created obligations and relationships that could not be packed up and carried away, and social bonds. The particular pull of knowing your neighbours, of sharing walls and harvests and grief, made the idea of leaving feel, over time, less like freedom and more like loss. These forces did not arrive all at once, and they did not arrive everywhere together. That is perhaps the most important thing to hold on to as this story settles. The rise of settled life was not a single revolution that swept across the ancient world like a wave. It was a patchwork, uneven, slow, and full of contradiction. While the walls of Jericho were already old, other communities were still following herds across open plains. While Uruk was pressing its first accounting marks into clay, entire continents remained home to people who had never planted a seed and had no wish to. Many communities remained mobile for thousands of years after the first settled places appeared, not because they had failed to discover the alternative, but because mobility still worked. It still made sense. It still answered the questions that life was asking them. Settlement, in the end, was an invention. Like all inventions, it solved certain problems and created others. It offered security and accumulated knowledge and the remarkable human experiment of living in close company with strangers. And it asked in return for labour and hierarchy and the slow surrender of the open horizon. The first cities were not a destination that history was always headed toward. They were one answer, found in particular places by particular people facing particular pressures, an answer that proved durable enough and complex enough to reshape everything that came after. And somewhere in that long, uneven, quietly extraordinary story, we find the beginning of the world we recognize as our own. If this journey through deep time kept you company tonight, consider leaving a like or sharing the video with someone who loves history. Subscribe so you never miss an episode, and tell us in the comments where in the world you are listening from. Sleep well.